I remember the exact moment my marriage ended, though my husband would not sign the papers for another year. It was not in a courtroom or a solicitor's office, but on a frozen December night, surrounded by the glittering masks of London society, as carriages rolled past like dark ships on a river of torchlight. The midnight procession had been a tradition since my grandmother's time, a spectacle of wealth and breeding where the finest families of England paraded through Hyde Park in their lacquered carriages, acknowledging one another with practiced nods and calculated smiles. I had attended every year since my debut at 17, first as the hopeful daughter of a baron, then as the Duchess of Blackwood, a title that should have meant everything and had come to mean nothing at all. My husband, Richard, the 5th Duke of Blackwood, sat beside me in our carriage that night. The velvet seats were cold despite the fur blankets, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the darkness. Richard had been silent for most of the evening, which was not unusual. In 3 years of marriage, I had grown accustomed to his silences, to the way he looked through me rather than at me, as if I were a window to something more interesting beyond. I was 23 years old, and I had already learned to make myself small, to ask for nothing, to expect even less. The procession moved slowly through the park, and I watched the other carriages pass with the detached interest of someone who has long since stopped believing in fairy tales. There was Lady Pemberton, her diamonds catching the torchlight like frozen tears. There was the Earl of Wessex, ancient and hunched, his young wife beside him, looking as trapped as a bird in a gilded cage. And there, in a carriage of midnight blue, was Lady Vivian Harcourt, the widow whose name was whispered in drawing rooms with a mixture of fascination and disdain. I did not think much of her then. She was simply another face in the parade of aristocratic excess, another woman who had learned to survive in a world that offered us so few choices. I could not have known that her name would soon become a wound I carried with me everywhere. The moment came without warning, as the worst moments always do. Richard shifted beside me, reaching into his coat for his pocket watch. The movement caused his collar to fall open slightly, and there, against the white of his shirt, I saw something that did not belong, a glint of gold, a delicate chain I had never seen before. I should have looked away. A wiser woman, a more experienced wife, would have pretended not to notice. But I was still foolish enough to believe that truth was something worth pursuing, still naive enough to think that my husband owed me honesty, if nothing else. "Richard," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "what is that around your neck?" He stiffened. In 3 years, I had learned to read the language of his body, the way his shoulders tensed when he was displeased, the way his jaw tightened when he was about to lie. I saw both of those things now, and something else too, something that looked almost like fear. "It is nothing," he said, "a trinket." But I had already seen it. The torchlight from a passing footman illuminated the carriage interior for just a moment, and in that moment, I saw the locket clearly. It was oval, rimmed with tiny pearls, hanging from a chain so fine it looked like spun gold. It was the kind of jewelry a man gives to a woman he loves, not the kind he purchases for himself. "May I see it?" I asked, though my voice had begun to tremble. Richard's hand moved to his chest, covering the locket as if to protect it. "Eleanor, this is not the time." "When would be the time, then?" I heard myself say. "When we return home? When you retire to your study and lock the door, as you do every night? When would be the appropriate moment for a wife to ask her husband about the jewelry he wears beneath his shirt?" He turned to look at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before. Not anger, not impatience, but something worse. Pity. "You do not want to do this here," he said quietly. But I did. God help me. I did. I reached for the locket before he could stop me, my fingers closing around the cold metal. Richard grabbed my wrist, but not before I had pulled the chain free from his collar, not before I had seen what hung at its end. The locket opened easily, as if it had been opened many times before. Inside, painted on ivory and miniature, was the face of a woman. She had dark hair and pale eyes, a beauty mark near her lips, and a smile that spoke of secrets shared and promises kept. She was beautiful in the way that certain women are beautiful, with an awareness of her own power that radiated even from this tiny portrait. I knew that face. I had seen it not 5 minutes ago, passing us in a carriage of midnight blue. Lady Vivian Harcourt. The world seemed to narrow to the size of that locket, to the painted eyes of my husband's lover staring up at me with something that looked almost like triumph. Around us, the procession continued, carriages rolling past in their endless parade of pretense, and I sat frozen, unable to breathe, unable to think, unable to do anything but stare at the evidence of my own humiliation. "Eleanor," Richard said, and his voice seemed to come from very far away. "Eleanor, you must understand." But I did not want to understand. Understanding was what I had been doing for 3 years. Understanding his coldness, understanding his absences, understanding the way he flinched when I reached for him in the darkness of our bedchamber. I had understood and understood and understood until there was nothing left of me but understanding, and now I found that I had no more left to give. "How long?" I asked. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, flat and distant, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. Richard did not answer immediately. He was looking at me with that same expression of pity, and I hated him for it. I hated him more in that moment than I had ever hated anyone in my life. "How long?" I asked again. 4 years, he said finally. 4 years. We had been married for 3. The mathematics of betrayal is simple, but its implications are devastating. Richard had been with her before we wed, had stood at the altar and spoken vows of fidelity while another woman's portrait hung against his heart. Every kiss he had given me, every duty he had performed in our marriage bed, had been a lie. I had never been his wife. I had been his obligation, his social necessity, the breeding stock his family required to continue the Blackwood line. I closed the locket with a click that seemed impossibly loud in the silence between us. "I want to go home," I said. "Eleanor, we must talk about this. I want to go home." Richard studied me for a long moment, as if trying to determine how much damage had been done, how much effort it would take to repair it. Then he signaled to the driver, and our carriage turned away from the procession, away from the torchlight and the watching eyes into the darkness of the London night. We did not speak during the journey back to Blackwood House. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, the locket still clutched in my fingers, and tried to make sense of what I had learned. But sense was impossible. There was no logic to betrayal, no reason to be found in the ashes of trust. When we arrived home, I went directly to my chambers without a word. My lady's maid, sweet Alice, who had been with me since my wedding day, took one look at my face and asked no questions. She helped me out of my gown, brushed out my hair, and left me alone with the single candle I had requested. I sat at my vanity and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The woman who looked back at me was a stranger, pale and hollow-eyed, wearing the face of someone who had just discovered that everything she believed was a lie. I was not beautiful, not in the way Lady Vivian was beautiful. My hair was the color of autumn leaves, my eyes an unremarkable brown, my features pleasant but forgettable. I had been raised to be a good wife, a gracious hostess, a dutiful daughter. No one had ever taught me how to be a woman whose husband loved someone else. I opened the locket again and looked at her face. Vivian Harcourt. I knew her story, or at least the version that circulated in drawing rooms and whispered conversations. She had married young, to a man 30 years her senior, and had been widowed at 22. There were rumors of affairs, of scandals barely contained, of a woman who played by different rules than the rest of us. I had always dismissed her as someone to be pitied, a creature of circumstance forced to trade on her beauty to survive. Now I saw her differently. Now I saw her as the woman my husband had chosen, the woman he loved, the woman whose portrait he wore against his heart while I slept alone in the chamber next to his. I do not know how long I sat there, staring at that painted face. Long enough for the candle to burn low, for the fire in the grate to fade to embers, for the first gray light of dawn to creep through the curtains. When Alice came to wake me, she found me still sitting at the vanity, the locket open in my hands, my eyes dry but my heart shattered beyond repair. "Your Grace," she said softly, and there was such tenderness in her voice that I nearly wept. "You should rest." But rest was impossible. Rest implied peace, and there was no peace to be found in this house, in this marriage, in this life I had built on foundations of sand. "Alice," I said, and my voice was steadier than I expected. "I need you to find out everything you can about Lady Vivian Harcourt." She hesitated only a moment before nodding. Alice had been with me long enough to know when questions were unwelcome, when loyalty meant silence and action rather than words. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. "I will begin today." I closed the locket and placed it in the drawer of my vanity beneath a pile of handkerchiefs I never used. I did not know yet what I would do with it, with the knowledge it represented, with the ruins of my marriage. But I knew that I could not continue as I had been, could not spend another 3 years understanding and accepting and making myself small. Something had changed in me during that midnight procession, as the carriages rolled past and my husband's secret hung between us like a blade. I had spent my whole life being what others expected me to be, a good daughter, a proper wife, a credit to my family's name. But goodness had not protected me. Propriety had not saved me. All my careful adherence to the rules of our world had earned me nothing but a husband who loved another woman and a future that stretched before me like an endless winter. I did not yet know what I would become. But as I watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, I made myself a promise. I would not spend the rest of my life as the Duchess of Blackwood, invisible and unloved, a ghost haunting the halls of a house that had never been my home. I would find a way out, or I would create one. The morning brought with it the rituals of a life that now felt foreign to me. I dressed, I ate breakfast alone in my sitting room, I reviewed the household accounts with the housekeeper as if nothing had changed. Mrs. Patterson noticed nothing amiss, or if she did, she was wise enough to keep her observations to herself. Servants always know more than we credit them for, but the good ones understand that knowledge is a currency best spent sparingly. Richard did not appear at breakfast. He did not appear at luncheon either. By the time the afternoon post arrived, I had not seen my husband since he had dropped me at the front steps the night before, disappearing into the darkness without so much as a backward glance. I found myself wandering through the house that afternoon, looking at it as if for the first time. Blackwood House was grand by any measure, a testament to 5 generations of accumulated wealth and impeccable taste. The walls were hung with portraits of Blackwood ancestors, stern men and elegant women who stared down at me with the same cold indifference I had come to expect from their living descendant. Crystal chandeliers caught the weak winter light and scattered it into rainbows across the polished floors. Every room was filled with beautiful objects, paintings and sculptures and furniture that had been in the family for centuries, and yet there was nothing of me in any of it. In 3 years of marriage, I had not added a single personal touch to this mausoleum of a house. I had been too afraid to change anything, too uncertain of my position, too desperate to please a husband who could not be pleased. The Duchess of Blackwood existed in name only. In reality, I was a guest in my own home, tolerated but never truly welcomed. I paused before a window that overlooked the garden, now barren and frosted with the early winter cold. Beyond the walls of the estate, London went about its business, carriages rattling past, street vendors calling their wares, children laughing somewhere in the distance. Life continued as it always had, indifferent to the quiet catastrophe unfolding within these elegant walls. I thought of my mother, who had died when I was 16, just before my debut into society. She had been a gentle woman, devoted to my father, content with her modest role in the world. I wondered what she would say to me now, if she could see what her daughter's marriage had become. Would she counsel patience, forgiveness, the quiet endurance that was expected of women in our position? Or would she perhaps surprise me? Would she reveal some hidden reserve of strength, some wisdom about survival that she had never had the chance to share? I would never know. That was one of the cruelest things about death, the conversations that could never be had, the questions that would forever remain unanswered. The sound of a carriage in the drive pulled me from my reverie. I watched from the window as Richard emerged from within, his coat collar turned up against the cold. He looked tired, I noticed, with shadows beneath his eyes and a heaviness to his movements that spoke of a sleepless night. Good, I thought, with a viciousness that surprised me. Let him suffer as I have suffered. But then I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. As Richard walked toward the house, he paused and looked up at the window where I stood. For a moment, our eyes met across the frozen garden, and in his gaze, I saw something that might have been regret. Or perhaps it was merely the cold making his eyes water. He looked away first, continuing toward the entrance, and I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding in a way it had not pounded for years. Not with love, but with something else. Something that felt like the first stirrings of a storm. I did not know yet what form that storm would take. I did not know that my life was about to change in ways I could never have imagined. That the midnight procession had set in motion a series of events that would lead me from the depths of despair to the heights of a happiness I had never dared to dream of. All I knew, in that moment, was that I would never again be the woman I had been before I saw that locket. That woman was gone, as surely as if she had died along with my marriage. In her place stood someone new, someone harder, someone who had learned in a single night that the only person she could truly rely on was herself. And I would never, ever let another person make me feel as small as I felt in that carriage, with the painted eyes of my husband's lover staring up at me from a locket that should have held my portrait, my face, my claim to a love that had never belonged to me at all. The weeks that followed the midnight procession were the loneliest of my life, and yet they were also the weeks in which I began to find myself again. It is strange how betrayal can strip away everything you thought you knew, leaving behind only the raw, essential truth of who you are when no one is watching. Alice proved invaluable in her quiet investigations. She had connections among the servants of London's great houses, a network of maids and footmen and cooks who traded information like currency. Within a fortnight, she had compiled a dossier on Lady Vivian Harcourt that would have made any Bow Street runner proud. Vivian had been born Vivian Beaumont, the daughter of a minor baronet with more debts than prospects. She had married Lord Harcourt at 18, a man of 62 with gout and a fortune built on coal mines in the north. The marriage had lasted 4 years, during which time Vivian had transformed herself from a country nobody into one of London's most sought-after hostesses. When Lord Harcourt died, he left her everything, a decision that had scandalized his family and delighted society gossips for months. But it was the timeline of her relationship with Richard that interested me most. According to Alice's sources, they had met at a house party in Kent, 6 months before Richard and I were betrothed. Their affair had begun almost immediately, a passionate entanglement that showed no signs of cooling even now. 4 years later, they were discreet, meeting in private homes and country estates, communicating through intermediaries and coded letters. But servants talk, and eventually, every secret finds its way into the light. I learned all of this with a strange detachment, as if I were reading about characters in a novel rather than the people who had shaped my own fate. Richard had never loved me. He had married me for my dowry, my family connections, my reputation for being biddable and undemanding. I had been chosen precisely because I was unlikely to cause trouble, unlikely to notice or care about his continued involvement with another woman. How thoroughly I had fulfilled his expectations. How completely I had played the role he had written for me. The knowledge should have devastated me further, but instead I found it oddly liberating. If Richard had never loved me, then I had lost nothing. The marriage I had mourned had never truly existed. I was not a woman whose husband had strayed, but a woman who had been deceived from the very beginning. There is a difference, subtle but significant, between being abandoned and being used. I began to change in small ways that Richard did not notice or chose to ignore. I started taking breakfast in the morning room rather than my private sitting chamber. I resumed my correspondence with friends I had neglected, women from my debut season who had married and scattered across England. I visited the lending library and chose books for myself rather than asking Richard what he thought appropriate. Small rebellions, perhaps, but they felt like victories nonetheless. It was during one of these library visits that I first encountered Lord Sebastian Hartwell again. I had known Sebastian in childhood, though known is perhaps too strong a word. Our families had been neighbors in Hertfordshire, our estates separated by a stream that we children had crossed countless times during long summer afternoons. Sebastian had been 5 years my senior, an eternity when one is young, and I had admired him from afar with the hopeless devotion of a girl who has read too many romantic novels. He had been kind to me, I remembered. While other older boys ignored the younger children or teased them mercilessly, Sebastian had always had a smile and a word for everyone. He had taught me to skip stones on the pond behind his family's estate. He had once rescued a robin's nest that had fallen from a tree, showing me how to feed the tiny, helpless creatures with a dropper until they were strong enough to survive on their own. Then his father had died, and Sebastian had inherited the earldom at 22. He had married a woman I never met, a Scottish heiress named Margaret, and they had gone abroad shortly after. I had heard fragments of news over the years that they had settled in Italy, that Margaret was unwell, that she had died 2 winters ago of a fever that swept through Florence. Beyond that, I knew nothing. I did not recognize him at first when I saw him standing in the philosophy section of Hookham's library. The boy I remembered had been lanky and awkward, all elbows and enthusiasm. The man who stood before me was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched with silver at the temples, and a face that bore the marks of sorrow. He was dressed simply, without the elaborate ornamentation that so many gentlemen affected, and he held a volume of Marcus Aurelius in his hands as if it were a precious thing. It was his eyes that I recognized. They were the same clear gray they had always been, the color of morning mist over water, and when they met mine across the crowded room, I felt something stir in my chest that I had not felt in years. "Lady Eleanor?" he said, and his voice was deeper than I remembered, but carried the same warmth. "Forgive me, I should say, Your Grace now. I heard of your marriage to Blackwood." "Lord Hartwell," I replied, surprised that my voice remained steady. "I did not know you had returned to England." He moved toward me through the maze of bookshelves, and I noticed that he walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg. A riding accident, perhaps, or some other misfortune acquired during his years abroad. "I arrived last month," he said. "I have been settling my affairs, reopening the house in Mayfair. It has been closed since." He paused, and I saw the shadow that crossed his face. "Since I left with Margaret." "I was sorry to hear of her passing," I said, and meant it. She was spoken of highly by all who knew her. Sebastian inclined his head, accepting the condolence with the practiced grace of a man who has received many such expressions. "She was remarkable," he said simply. "I was fortunate to have had her, even for so short a time." There was a silence then, the kind of silence that occurs when two people recognize something in each other that neither is quite ready to name. I was acutely aware of the impropriety of our conversation, a married woman speaking alone with a widower in a public place. But the library was crowded with respectable patrons, and what harm could come from a few exchanged pleasantries with an old acquaintance? "And you, Your Grace?" Sebastian asked. "Are you well? Forgive my forwardness, but you seem—" He hesitated, searching for the right word. "Changed, from the girl I remember." I might have deflected the observation, offered some polite fiction about the passage of time or the responsibilities of marriage. But there was something in his gaze that invited honesty, a gentleness that I had not encountered in so long that I had forgotten it existed. "I am changed," I admitted, though I am only now beginning to understand how much. He studied me for a long moment, and I had the unsettling feeling that he saw more than I intended to reveal. Sebastian had always been perceptive, I remembered, a quality that had made him both a wonderful friend and a terrible opponent at cards. "Change is not always unwelcome," he said finally. "Sometimes it is the fire that forges us into who we were always meant to be." Before I could respond, the library door opened and a group of young ladies entered, their chatter filling the quiet space like the sudden arrival of sparrows. The moment between Sebastian and me was broken, and I felt its loss more keenly than I would have expected. "I should go," I said. "My carriage will be waiting." "Of course." Sebastian bowed formally, but his eyes held mine. "It was a pleasure to see you again, Your Grace. I hope we might continue our conversation sometime. Perhaps at Lady Ashworth's musicale next week. I understand it is to be the event of the season." I had received the invitation to Lady Ashworth's musicale and had planned to decline. Richard never accompanied me to such events, and I had grown weary of attending them alone, of fielding questions about my husband's absence while pretending that everything was perfectly fine. But something in Sebastian's voice, some note of genuine interest that had nothing to do with politeness, made me reconsider. "Perhaps," I said. I had not yet decided whether to attend. "Then allow me to add my encouragement to whatever other considerations you are weighing. I find these social obligations tedious beyond measure, but they become somewhat more bearable in good company." I felt a flush rise to my cheeks at the implication of his words. When had I last been called good company? When had anyone suggested that my presence might make an evening more bearable rather than less? "I will consider it," I said, and allowed myself a small smile. "Good day, Lord Hartwell." "Good day, Your Grace." I left the library with my heart beating faster than it had any right to beat. Nothing improper had occurred between us. We had exchanged nothing more than pleasantries, the kind of conversation that happened 1,000 times a day between acquaintances who encountered each other in public places. And yet I felt as if something significant had shifted, as if the ground beneath my feet had become slightly less stable. The carriage ride home was torture. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, replaying our conversation in my mind, analyzing every word and glance for meaning that probably was not there. I was being foolish, I told myself. Sebastian had been polite, nothing more. He was a widower who had loved his wife, a man still shrouded in grief. His kindness to me was likely nothing more than the habit of a naturally generous spirit. And yet I could not shake the feeling that he had seen me, truly seen me, in a way that Richard never had. In those few minutes of conversation, Sebastian had noticed that I was changed. He had asked if I was well with genuine concern in his voice. He had spoken to me as if I were a person worth speaking to, rather than an ornament to be displayed or a duty to be fulfilled. It was such a small thing, being seen, and yet it felt like everything. When I arrived home, I found Richard waiting for me in the entrance hall. This was so unusual that I stopped in my tracks, my heart lurching with sudden fear. Had something happened? Had someone died? "We need to talk," he said, and his voice was cold in a way I had not heard before. He led me to his study, a room I rarely entered, and closed the door behind us. The space was dominated by a massive mahogany desk covered in papers, and the walls were lined with books that I suspected Richard had never read. It smelled of tobacco and leather and something else, something that might have been Vivian's perfume clinging to the furniture. "It has come to my attention," Richard said, settling into the chair behind his desk as if he were a magistrate about to deliver a verdict, "that you have been making inquiries about Lady Harcourt." I felt the blood drain from my face. Alice. Someone had noticed Alice's questions and reported them back to Richard or to Vivian herself. "I do not know what you mean," I said, but even to my own ears the denial sounded weak. Richard's expression did not change. "Do not insult my intelligence, Eleanor. I know that your maid has been asking questions among the servants. I know that you have been gathering information about my association with Lady Harcourt." Association. Such a civilized word for such an uncivilized arrangement. "What did you expect me to do?" I asked, and I was surprised to find that my voice did not tremble. "You have been conducting an affair under my very nose for 4 years. Did you think I would simply accept it and ask no questions?" "I expected you to have the discretion that your breeding should have instilled in you," Richard replied. "I expected you to understand that there are certain matters best left unexamined." "Discretion," I repeated, and I heard the bitterness in my own voice. "You speak to me of discretion when you wear her portrait around your neck at public events. When half of London knows that you keep a mistress while your wife sits alone in an empty house?" Something flickered in Richard's eyes, surprise perhaps, or a grudging respect for my unexpected show of spine. "Half of London may suspect," he said, "but suspicion and proof are very different things. Your maid's inquiries threaten to turn suspicion into scandal, and scandal is something neither of us can afford." "Neither of us?" I laughed, though there was no humor in it. "You are the one who has been unfaithful. You are the one who made vows before God and broke them without a moment's hesitation. How dare you speak to me of scandal as if I were equally culpable?" Richard rose from his chair and moved toward me, and for a moment I thought he might strike me. But he stopped an arm's length away, his hands clenched at his sides, and when he spoke, his voice was low and dangerous. "Let me be clear, Eleanor. I will not tolerate interference in my private affairs. You are my wife, and you will conduct yourself accordingly. You will dismiss your maid and hire someone whose loyalty is more reliable. You will cease all inquiries into Lady Harcourt, and you will attend social functions on my arm as if nothing has changed between us." "And if I refuse?" The question hung between us like a blade. I watched Richard's face, saw the calculation behind his cold eyes, and waited for his response. "If you refuse," he said slowly, "I will make your life very difficult indeed. Do not forget that everything you have, your home, your position, your allowance, comes from me. I can take it all away with a word." It was not an empty threat. I knew the law as well as he did, knew that a wife was little more than her husband's property in the eyes of English courts. He could deny me access to my own children if I ever bore any, could lock me away in the country, could cut off my funds and leave me dependent on his charity for every meal I ate and every dress I wore. But something had changed in me since that night at the midnight procession. The woman who had entered that carriage would have capitulated immediately, would have apologized and promised to be more discreet and retreated to her private rooms to weep in silence. That woman was gone. "Very well," I said, and my voice was steady. "I understand your position. Now let me explain mine." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly, the only sign of his surprise. "I will not dismiss Alice," I continued. "She has been loyal to me for 3 years, and I will not punish her for doing what I asked. I will not cease my inquiries because I have a right to know the truth about my own marriage. And I will not pretend that nothing has changed because everything has changed, and I refuse to play act at happiness for the benefit of people who do not care whether I am happy or not." I took a step closer to him, close enough to see the tiny lines around his eyes, the gray beginning to show in his dark hair. close enough to smell Vivian's perfume more clearly, a cloying floral scent that made my stomach turn. "But I will make you a bargain," I said. "I will be discreet. I will not create a scandal that would damage your precious reputation. I will appear at your side when required and play the role of the devoted wife in public. In return, you will leave me alone. You will not dictate whom I employ or whom I speak to or how I spend my time. You will give me the freedom to live my own life within the confines of this mockery of a marriage." Richard stared at me for a long moment, and I could not read the expression on his face. Then slowly, he began to smile. It was not a kind smile, but it was an acknowledgement of something. Perhaps my transformation from the malleable girl he had married into a woman who could negotiate for her own survival. "You have surprised me, Eleanor," he said. "I did not think you had it in you." "There is a great deal about me you do not know," I replied. "Perhaps if you had bothered to find out, we would not be having this conversation." He inclined his head, conceding the point. "Very well. We have an agreement. But understand this, if you betray me, if you do anything to threaten my position or my relationship with Vivian, I will show you no mercy." "I understand," I said. "And you should understand this as well. I am no longer the frightened girl you married. I have nothing left to lose, Richard. And that makes me far more dangerous than you realize." I turned and left his study without waiting for his response. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. But I had done it. I had stood up to him, had claimed some small measure of autonomy in a marriage that had offered me none. It was not freedom, not yet. But it was a beginning. I wore blue to Lady Ashworth's music hall, a gown of midnight silk that Alice had helped me choose from the depths of my wardrobe. It was a dress I had never worn before, purchased during my trousseau preparations and then forgotten, deemed too bold by the timid bride I had been. The bodice was cut lower than I typically allowed, and the color made my skin glow like pearls in candlelight. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw a stranger, a woman who might attend a party alone and hold her head high despite the whispers that would surely follow. Richard had not asked if I planned to attend. Since our confrontation in his study 3 days prior, we had barely spoken, passing each other in the halls of Blackwood House like ships in fog. He spent his nights elsewhere, presumably with Vivian, and I found that I did not care. The absence of his cold presence was a relief rather than a wound. The Ashworth townhouse blazed with light as my carriage pulled into the queue of vehicles waiting to deposit their elegant passengers. Through the windows, I could see silhouettes moving behind gauze curtains, the glitter of jewels and the flutter of fans. Music drifted out into the night air, a pianoforte being played with more enthusiasm than skill. Lady Ashworth's musicals were famous for their ambitious programming and uneven execution, but no one attended for the music. They attended to see and be seen, to trade gossip and evaluate the competition. I entered alone, acutely aware of the eyes that followed me as I made my way through the crowded rooms. The Duchess of Blackwood without her Duke, that was noteworthy. I could practically hear the speculations beginning, the theories being formed and discarded and reformed as society tried to make sense of my solitary appearance. Let them wonder, I thought. Let them gossip. I am done caring what they think of me. Lady Ashworth herself greeted me with effusive warmth that did not quite reach her eyes. She was a plump woman of 50, draped in enough diamonds to fund a small country, and she had been the reigning queen of London's social scene for as long as anyone could remember. Her approval could make a debutante's career, her disapproval could destroy it, and her curiosity about the state of my marriage was barely concealed behind her practiced smile. "Your Grace, what a delight," she said, clasping my hands in her bejeweled fingers. "We so rarely see you at these affairs without the Duke. I do hope he is well?" "Quite well, thank you," I replied, matching her false warmth with my own. "He sends his regrets. Affairs of business, you understand." Of course, of course." Lady Ashworth's eyes glittered with the knowledge that affairs of business was the polite fiction employed when the real business was too scandalous to name. "Well, you must not let his absence prevent you from enjoying yourself. I believe Lord Hartwell has been asking after you. Such a tragic figure, do you not think? Widowed so young, and devoted to his wife until the very end. One cannot help but admire such constancy." She delivered this information with the air of someone presenting a particularly juicy piece of gossip, and I understood immediately what she was doing. Lady Ashworth was testing me, watching to see how I would react to the mention of Sebastian's name. In her world, any connection between a married woman and an eligible widower was potential scandal, and she was nothing if not a collector of scandal. "Lord Hartwell and I are old acquaintances," I said mildly. "Our families were neighbors in Hertfordshire. I was pleased to hear of his return to England." "Indeed, indeed." Lady Ashworth's smile widened, and I knew she had filed away this piece of information for later use. "Well, I shall not keep you. The music is about to begin, and I believe Miss Thornton has prepared something quite special for us this evening." I escaped into the music room, where rows of gilt chairs had been arranged before a small stage. The room was already crowded with guests, their conversation creating a low hum that would likely continue throughout the performance. I found a seat near the back, preferring to observe rather than be observed, and settled in to wait. I saw Sebastian before he saw me. He was standing near the fireplace, engaged in conversation with an elderly gentleman I recognized as Lord Pemberton, one of Richard's parliamentary allies. Sebastian looked uncomfortable in his formal attire, tugging occasionally at his cravat as if it were strangling him. I remembered that about him from our childhood, his impatience with the trappings of his station, his preference for open fields and honest conversation over ballrooms and social pretense. As if sensing my gaze, he looked up, and our eyes met across the crowded room. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Sebastian excused himself from Lord Pemberton and began making his way toward me, navigating the maze of chairs and chattering guests with the determination of a man on a mission. "You came," he said when he reached me, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like relief. "I said I would consider it," I reminded him. "I considered, and here I am." "Here you are." He smiled, and I noticed the way it transformed his face, softening the lines of grief and weariness into something warmer. "May I sit beside you? I find I cannot face Miss Thornton's rendition of Italian arias without reinforcement." I gestured to the empty chair beside me, and he settled into it with a sigh of contentment that seemed disproportionate to the simple act of sitting down. We were close enough that I could smell his cologne, something clean and woodsy that reminded me of forests after rain. "You look well," he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Different from the library, less burdened." "I have had an eventful week," I admitted. "Certain truths have been spoken that were long overdue." He studied me with those gray eyes that seemed to see everything. Truths have a way of clearing the air, even when they are painful. I learned that in Italy, sitting beside Margaret's bed in those final weeks. We said things to each other that we had avoided for years, and it was liberating in a terrible way. "What kind of things?" I asked, then immediately regretted the question. "Forgive me, that was too personal." "No, it is a fair question." Sebastian was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to some point beyond the room, beyond the present. We spoke of our regrets, the children we never had, the dreams we had postponed, always believing there would be more time. She told me that she was grateful for our years together, but that she wished I had let her see my grief more often, that I had not always tried to be strong for her sake. "And what did you tell her?" "That I wished I had been braver, that I had spent too much of our marriage being careful, being proper, being what I thought a good husband should be, instead of simply being the man who loved her." He turned back to me, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. She died knowing that I loved her, which is more than many people can say. But I will always wonder if she knew how much. The music began before I could respond, Miss Thornton taking her place at the pianoforte with nervous energy that did not bode well for the performance to come. But I was not thinking about the music. I was thinking about Sebastian's words, about the regrets he had carried across continents and years, about the weight of things left unsaid. I thought of Richard, of the silence that had defined our marriage from the very beginning. Had I ever told him what I truly felt? Had I ever been brave enough to demand that he see me, truly see me, as a person rather than a possession? The answer, I knew, was no. I had been as careful and proper as Sebastian had been, and look where it had gotten me. Miss Thornton launched into her first aria with admirable confidence and questionable pitch. Around us, the audience maintained expressions of polite attention while their minds wandered to more interesting subjects. I felt Sebastian shift beside me, his shoulder brushing against mine in a way that could have been accidental but did not feel accidental at all. "I have been thinking," he murmured, his lips close to my ear, "about what you said in the library, about being changed." "Have you?" I kept my eyes fixed on the stage, though I was acutely aware of his nearness. I recognized that feeling. When Margaret died, I felt as though I had been unmade and remade into someone new, someone who did not quite fit into the shape of my old life. "And did you find a new shape?" I asked. "A new life that fit?" "I am still looking." His hand found mine in the darkness between our chairs, hidden by the folds of my gown. The touch was light, barely there, but it sent a shock through me that was entirely out of proportion to its innocence. "But I am beginning to think that I might have found someone to look with." I should have pulled my hand away. I should have reminded him that I was a married woman, that this was improper, that we were surrounded by the most dedicated gossips in all of London. But I did none of those things. Instead, I let my fingers intertwine with his, let the warmth of his palm seep into my skin, and felt something crack open in my chest that had been sealed shut for longer than I could remember. We sat like that through 3 arias, a violin solo, and a duet that might have been beautiful if either performer had possessed a sense of rhythm. When the music finally ended and the audience rose to applaud with relief as much as appreciation, Sebastian released my hand with obvious reluctance. "Walk with me," he said. "Lady Ashworth's garden is said to be quite fine, and I find myself in desperate need of fresh air." It was an invitation that no respectable married woman should accept. The gardens at these events were notorious hunting grounds for those seeking private assignations, and to be seen there with an eligible widower would set tongues wagging for weeks. But I thought of my bargain with Richard, of my promise to be discreet, and I realized that discretion did not require me to be miserable. "Lead the way," I said. The garden was indeed fine, a formal arrangement of hedges and flower beds now dormant in the winter cold. Torches had been placed along the main paths, creating pools of flickering light interspersed with shadows deep enough to hide a multitude of sins. A few other couples wandered the paths, their voices low and intimate, but Sebastian led me away from them, toward a stone bench tucked into an alcove of evergreen hedges. "I should not have held your hand," he said when we were seated, his voice rough with something that might have been regret. "It was forward of me, and you are." "Married," I finished for him. "Yes, I am aware of my circumstances. I did not mean to complicate them." "You did not complicate them. They were complicated long before you arrived." I looked up at the sky, where stars glittered like diamonds scattered on black velvet. "My marriage has been a performance from the very beginning, Lord Hartwell, a show put on for the benefit of society, with neither of the principal actors believing in their roles." "Sebastian," he said, "please, we knew each other as children. I cannot bear for you to call me by my title when we are speaking of such things. Sebastian, then." The name felt strange on my tongue, intimate in a way that surprised me. and you must call me Eleanor. Eleanor. He said it like a prayer, like something precious and fragile. What happened to you? The girl I remember was bright and hopeful. This woman beside me is wounded in ways I cannot quite understand. So I told him, not everything, not the details that were too raw to share, but enough. I told him about the midnight procession and the locket, about Vivian Harcourt and the 4 years of deception that had preceded my discovery. I told him about my confrontation with Richard, about the bargain we had struck, about my determination to carve out some measure of freedom within the prison of my marriage. Sebastian listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with each revelation. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. "I would like to kill him," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled fury. "I know that is not helpful or appropriate, but I want you to know that the impulse exists." Despite everything, I laughed. It was a small sound, rusty with disuse, but genuine. "I appreciate the sentiment, though I would prefer you did not act upon it. Hanging is so unfashionable this season. Eleanor." He turned to face me, and in the torchlight, his eyes were dark with emotion. "You deserve so much more than this. You deserve a husband who sees your worth, who treasures you, who counts himself blessed to have won your heart." "Perhaps," I said. "But deserving something and receiving it are very different things, as I have learned. I am trying to make peace with the life I have, rather than mourning the life I wanted." "And what life did you want?" The question hung between us, heavy with implications. What did I want? I had stopped asking myself that question years ago, stopped believing that my wants mattered in a world that cared only for duty and appearances. "I wanted to be loved," I said finally, and the admission felt like tearing open an old wound. Not tolerated or managed or displayed, loved. I wanted someone to look at me the way you looked at Margaret, as if I were the center of their universe. That is not an unreasonable want. Perhaps not, but it was an impossible one, given my circumstances. Sebastian reached out and took my hand again, not furtively this time, but openly, as if he did not care who might see. His thumb traced circles on my palm, a gesture so tender it made my throat tight with unshed tears. "Nothing is impossible," he said. "Improbable, perhaps. Difficult, certainly, but not impossible. I did not think I would ever feel anything again after Margaret died. I thought that part of me had been buried with her, that I would spend the rest of my life going through the motions of living without ever truly being alive. And now? Now I am sitting in a frozen garden with a woman I barely know, feeling things I had forgotten I was capable of feeling." His grip on my hand tightened. "I am not asking anything of you, Eleanor. I know your situation is complicated, and I would never do anything to jeopardize your position. But I want you to know that you are not alone. Whatever comes, whatever you need, I am here." I looked at him, at this man who had appeared in my life at precisely the moment when I had given up hope, and I felt something bloom in my chest that I was afraid to name. It was too soon, too dangerous, too fraught with potential for disaster. But it was also the first real thing I had felt in years, and I could not bring myself to push it away. "Thank you," I said. "I do not know what the future holds or what path I will ultimately choose, but thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists in the world." He lifted my hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to my knuckles, a gesture that was courtly and chaste and yet somehow more intimate than anything Richard had ever done in our marriage bed. "I should take you back inside," he said reluctantly. "We have been gone too long, and I will not be responsible for damaging your reputation." "My reputation," I repeated with a bitter smile. "I am beginning to wonder if reputations are worth the sacrifices we make to preserve them." "They are not," Sebastian said with conviction. "But they are useful tools nonetheless, And right now, your reputation is one of the few weapons you possess. We must be careful not to squander it." He was right, of course. I knew he was right. And yet, as we walked back toward the lights of the house, I found myself wishing that we did not have to be so careful. That we could be two people who had found each other in the darkness, without all the complications of class and marriage, and society's endless, exhausting expectations. But that was not the world we lived in. And so I composed my face into an expression of polite neutrality, released Sebastian's arm before we reached the terrace doors, and walked back into Lady Ashworth's music hall as if nothing had changed. Everything had changed, but no one needed to know that yet. The scandal broke on a Tuesday morning, delivered with my breakfast tray in the form of the society pages. I had known it was coming. In the weeks since Lady Ashworth's music hall, Sebastian and I had been careful, so careful, meeting only at public events, exchanging nothing more than conversation and the occasional stolen glance. But London society has eyes everywhere, and those eyes had been watching us with increasing interest. The Duchess of Blackwood and the widowed Earl of Hartwell, always in conversation at parties, always finding each other across crowded rooms, always leaving events at suspiciously similar times. The article did not name us directly, of course. Libel laws prevented such boldness, but the description was unmistakable. A certain duchess whose husband prefers other company, and a grieving earl recently returned from the continent. The implications were clear to anyone who cared to read between the lines, which was everyone. I read the article 3 times, my tea growing cold in its cup, while Alice hovered anxiously at my elbow. The words blurred before my eyes, not because of tears, but because of the strange disconnection I felt from the situation. This was my life being dissected for public entertainment, my reputation being shredded by anonymous hands, and yet I felt almost nothing. Perhaps I had exhausted my capacity for shock. Perhaps after everything Richard had done, the judgment of strangers simply did not matter anymore. "Your Grace," Alice said hesitantly, "perhaps you should not attend the Winterbourne ball tonight, given the circumstances." The Winterbourne ball. I had forgotten about it entirely, though it had been on my calendar for weeks. It was to be one of the last major events before society retreated to their country estates for Christmas, a final opportunity for the ton to see and be seen before the long winter hiatus. "No," I said, setting down the paper with a decisiveness that surprised even me. "I will attend. If I hide now, they will assume the worst. The only way to survive scandal is to face it directly." Alice's expression suggested she disagreed with this assessment, but she knew better than to argue. Instead, she began preparing my bath, her silence speaking volumes about her concerns. I spent the day in a strange state of suspended animation, going through the motions of my usual routine while my mind raced with calculations and contingencies. Richard had not yet seen the article, as far as I knew, but it was only a matter of time. When he discovered that his wife was being linked romantically to another man, his reaction would be swift and brutal. The irony of his potential outrage, given his own ongoing affair, was not lost on me. Sebastian sent a note in the afternoon, delivered by a footman in unmarked livery. I recognized his handwriting immediately, the bold strokes that had become as familiar to me as my own. "I have seen the papers," he wrote. "I am sorry for any distress this has caused you. If you wish me to stay away tonight, I will understand. But if you choose to attend, know that I will be there, and I will stand beside you regardless of what anyone says." I pressed the paper to my chest and allowed myself a moment of weakness, a moment to feel the warmth that his words kindled in my heart. Then I burned the note in the fireplace and began preparing for battle. The gown I chose was crimson, a color I had never worn before, a color that announced defiance rather than retreat. Alice styled my hair elaborately, threading pearls through the auburn curls, and I wore my mother's ruby earrings, the ones my father had given her on their wedding day. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw a woman I barely recognized, someone fierce and determined and entirely unwilling to be destroyed by the petty machinations of society gossips. Richard intercepted me in the entrance hall as I was about to leave. He was dressed for the ball himself, though we had not discussed attending together, and his expression was thunderous. "You are not going," he said flatly. "I am going," I replied, pulling on my gloves with deliberate calm, "and you will escort me as a proper husband should." "Have you lost your mind entirely? The papers are full of speculation about you and Hartwell. If you appear tonight, you will only confirm their suspicions." "And if I do not appear, I will confirm them even more thoroughly." I met his gaze without flinching. "You taught me this game, Richard. You taught me that in society, perception is everything. If I hide, I am guilty. If I face them, I am brave. Which do you think will serve us better?" He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. Richard was many things, but he was not stupid. He understood the logic of what I was saying, even if he hated the circumstances that had made it necessary. "Very well," he said finally. "We will attend together. But you will stay by my side all evening, and you will not speak to Hartwell. Do you understand?" "I understand what you want," I said. "Whether I will comply remains to be seen." His jaw tightened, but he offered me his arm, and together we walked out to the waiting carriage. It was the closest thing to solidarity we had shared in months, though it was born of mutual self-interest rather than affection. The Winterbourne mansion was ablaze with light and noise as our carriage joined the queue of vehicles waiting to deposit their passengers. I could feel the tension radiating from Richard beside me, could see the rigid set of his shoulders beneath his perfectly tailored coat. He was preparing for battle too, I realized, though his enemy was not the same as mine. We entered the ballroom together, and I felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes turning toward us. The conversation did not stop exactly, but it shifted, becoming more subdued, more watchful. I lifted my chin and smiled, the perfect society smile I had been practicing since my debut, and allowed Richard to lead me into the crowd. The first hour was torture. We made the rounds together, exchanging pleasantries with acquaintances who could barely conceal their curiosity, accepting condolences for illnesses we did not have, and congratulations for accomplishments we had not achieved. Everyone was fishing for information, trying to determine the true state of our marriage, the reality behind the rumors. I gave them nothing, my responses polished and empty, my expression revealing nothing of the turmoil beneath. I saw Sebastian across the room, standing alone near a pillar, his eyes following my progress through the crowd. He looked tired, I thought, with shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. When our gazes met, he inclined his head slightly, a greeting that was also a question. I wanted desperately to go to him, to feel the comfort of his presence, but Richard's hand was firm on my arm, and I knew that any approach would be noticed and remarked upon. The confrontation I had been dreading came shortly before midnight, though not from the quarter I had expected. Lady Vivian Harcourt approached us during a lull in the dancing, her dark hair piled elaborately atop her head, her gown a deep purple that should have clashed with my crimson, but somehow managed to complement it instead. She was beautiful, I had to admit, with a confident grace that I had never quite managed to achieve. Looking at her, I understood why Richard had been captivated, even as I hated her for it. "Your Grace," she said, addressing me directly with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "What a pleasure to see you out in society. I had heard you were feeling unwell." "You were misinformed," I replied coolly. "I am in excellent health." How fortunate. Her gaze flickered to Richard, and something passed between them that I was not meant to see. "And how brave of you to attend tonight, given the unfortunate speculation in the papers. Lesser women might have hidden away." "I am not a lesser woman." "No," Vivian said slowly, studying me with new interest. "I am beginning to see that you are not." Richard cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with this exchange. Lady Harcourt, if you will excuse us, I believe my wife promised this dance to Lord Pemberton." "Of course." Vivian stepped aside, but not before leaning close to me and whispering something that only I could hear. "You should know that I never intended to hurt you. Richard and I... It was never about you." I had no response to that. What could I say? That her absolution meant nothing to me? That her intentions did not change the reality of my shattered marriage? I simply nodded and allowed Richard to lead me away, my heart pounding with emotions I could not name. The dance with Lord Pemberton was mercifully brief, and when it ended, I excused myself to the ladies' retiring room, desperate for a moment alone. The room was empty when I arrived, and I sank onto a velvet settee with a sigh of relief, closing my eyes against the brightness of the candles. I did not hear the door open, did not know I was no longer alone until a familiar voice spoke my name. "Eleanor." I opened my eyes to find Sebastian standing before me, his expression a mixture of concern and determination. He should not have been there, in the private domain of ladies, but I found I did not care about the impropriety. I was so tired of caring about impropriety. "You should not be here," I said, though I made no move to send him away. "I know, but I could not stand by and watch you suffer alone any longer." He knelt before me, taking my hands in his. "Tell me what you need. Tell me how I can help." "You cannot help," I said, and my voice broke on the words. "This situation is beyond help. My marriage is a farce, my reputation is in tatters, and the woman my husband loves just offered me her condolences as if I were mourning a death." "Perhaps you are," Sebastian said gently. "Perhaps you are mourning the death of the life you thought you would have." The tears came then, despite my best efforts to hold them back. They streamed down my face, ruining the careful cosmetics Alice had applied, destroying the mask of composure I had maintained all evening. Sebastian gathered me into his arms without hesitation, holding me against his chest while I wept for everything I had lost and everything I had never truly had. "I love you," he said quietly, his lips against my hair. "I know I should not say it. Know that it only complicates matters further. But I cannot pretend any more. I love you, Eleanor. I have loved you since that day in the library when you looked at me with such sadness in your eyes, and I recognized a kindred spirit. Sebastian." I pulled back to look at him, to search his face for any sign of deception or manipulation. But there was nothing there except honesty, raw and unguarded, the kind of honesty I had been craving my entire life. "You do not have to say it back," he continued. "You do not have to feel the same way. But I want you to know that whatever happens, whatever you decide to do about your marriage, I will be here. If you choose to stay with Richard, I will respect that choice and keep my distance. If you choose to leave him, I will help you in any way I can. But I will not pretend that I do not love you. Not anymore." I thought of Richard, of the cold emptiness of our marriage, of the years stretching before me like a barren landscape. I thought of Vivienne, of the locket that still lay hidden in my vanity drawer, of all the lies that had built the foundation of my life. And I thought of Sebastian, of his kindness and his honesty, and the way he looked at me as if I were the most precious thing in the world. "I love you too," I whispered, and the words felt like a key turning in a lock, like a door swinging open onto a future I had never dared to imagine. Sebastian kissed me then, a gentle press of lips that promised everything and demanded nothing. It was not the passionate embrace of lovers in a novel, but something more profound, a sealing of a bond that had been forming since the moment we first met in that crowded library. The door to the retiring room opened, and we sprang apart, but not quickly enough. Lady Ashworth stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock and unmistakable delight. She had found the scandal she had been seeking all season, delivered to her on a silver platter. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "This is most unexpected." I stood, my chin high despite the tears still damp on my cheeks. "Lady Ashworth, Lord Hartwell was merely offering comfort to a friend in distress." "I am sure he was." Her smile was predatory. "I am sure that is exactly what was happening." Sebastian stepped forward, positioning himself between me and Lady Ashworth like a shield. "Whatever you think you saw, my lady, I would ask you to consider the consequences before you speak of it. The Duchess has done nothing wrong." "The Duchess was kissing a man who is not her husband in a public place," Lady Ashworth replied sweetly. "I hardly think that qualifies as nothing." "It was a moment of weakness," I said, and my voice was steadier than I expected. "A moment that will not be repeated. I would be grateful for your discretion." Lady Ashworth laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Discretion? My dear Duchess, discretion is for those who have something to offer in return. What could you possibly offer me that would be worth keeping such a delicious secret?" I looked at her, at this woman who traded in misery and scandal, who had built her social empire on the ruins of other people's lives, and I felt something shift inside me, a final snapping of the bonds that had held me to the expectations of this world. "Nothing," I said. "I have nothing to offer you, and I find that I do not care. Tell whoever you wish. Write to every society paper in London. I am done living my life in fear of women like you." Lady Ashworth's eyes widened, and for a moment I saw something that might have been respect flicker across her face. Then her expression hardened, and she turned on her heel and swept out of the room, no doubt already composing the story she would tell. "Eleanor," Sebastian said urgently, "we need to leave, now, before she has a chance to spread her tale." "No." I shook my head, wiping the last of my tears from my cheeks. "I will not run. I will walk back into that ballroom, and I will hold my head high, and I will let them see that their judgment cannot touch me. They will destroy you. Perhaps." I took his hand in mine and squeezed it gently. "Or perhaps they will find that I am not as easy to destroy as they imagine. Either way, I am done hiding. I am done pretending. Whatever comes next, I will face it as myself, not as the timid creature society expected me to be." Sebastian looked at me for a long moment, and then he smiled, a smile that held pride and love and a fierce determination that matched my own. "Then we will face it together," he said. "If you will have me." "I will have you," I replied, "whatever that means. Whatever it costs, I will have you." We walked back into the ballroom together, my hand on his arm, our heads held high. The whispers started immediately, a rising tide of shock and speculation that followed us across the room. I saw Richard's face, white with fury, saw Vivienne's expression of genuine surprise, saw Lady Ashworth holding court in a corner, already spreading her poison. And I found that I did not care. For the first time in my life, I did not care what any of them thought. I had found something real, something true, something worth fighting for, and I would fight for it with everything I had. The scandal had only just begun, but so had my new life. The weeks that followed the Winterbourne ball were the most turbulent of my life, and yet, paradoxically, they were also the most peaceful. There is a strange calm that comes with the death of pretense, a liberation in having nothing left to hide. Richard confronted me the morning after the ball, bursting into my chambers before Alice had even finished dressing my hair. His face was mottled with rage, his carefully cultivated composure shattered beyond repair. "You have ruined us," he spat. "You have ruined everything." I dismissed Alice with a gentle nod and turned to face my husband with a serenity that seemed to infuriate him further. "I have ruined nothing that was not already broken. I have merely made public what you have kept private for years. This is not the same thing, and you know it. My affair with Vivienne was conducted with discretion. Yours was announced to the entire ballroom. Your affair with Vivienne was conducted with such discretion that I discovered it at a public event, wearing her portrait around your neck. I stood, drawing myself up to my full height. You do not get to lecture me on propriety, Richard. You lost that right the moment you married me while loving another woman. He advanced toward me, and for a moment I thought he might strike me. But something in my expression gave him pause, some steel in my gaze that he had never seen before. "What do you want?" he asked finally, his voice low and dangerous. "What is this performance meant to achieve?" "I want a divorce." The word hung between us like a blade. Divorce was rare in our world, scandalous beyond measure, reserved for the most extreme circumstances of cruelty or abandonment. It would destroy my reputation, such as it was. It would make me a pariah in the eyes of society. But it would also set me free. "Impossible," Richard said flatly. "I will never agree to it." "Then I will make it impossible for you to refuse." I moved to my vanity and retrieved the locket from its hiding place. The painted eyes of Vivienne Harcourt staring up at us both. "I have this. I have the testimony of a dozen servants who can attest to your visits to Lady Harcourt's residence. I have letters, Richard. Letters you wrote to her that were carelessly discarded and retrieved by loyal members of my household." His face went pale. "You are bluffing." "Am I?" I opened the drawer further and withdrew a bundle of papers tied with ribbon. "Shall I read you some of the more passionate passages? I found them quite educational, if somewhat repetitive in their imagery." Richard sank into a chair, his bravado crumbling. He looked older suddenly, diminished, a man who had built his life on secrets and was watching them all come tumbling down. "What do you want?" he asked again, and this time there was defeat in his voice. "I want my freedom. I want a settlement that will allow me to live independently. I want you to agree to the divorce quietly, without contesting it, and I want you to take responsibility for the failure of our marriage in whatever legal proceedings are necessary." "And in return?" "In return, I will not publish your letters. I will not parade your mistress through the courts. I will allow you to marry her, eventually, once a decent interval has passed, and I will never speak of this matter publicly again." Richard was silent for a long moment, staring at the bundle of letters in my hand. I could see him calculating, weighing his options, searching for some way out of the trap I had laid. But there was no escape. I had learned from the best, after all. I had learned from him. "Very well," he said finally. "You shall have your divorce. But know this, Eleanor, you will never be received in good society again. You will be a fallen woman, an outcast, a cautionary tale mothers tell their daughters." "Perhaps," I said, "or perhaps society will prove more forgiving than you imagine. Either way, I find that I no longer care. I would rather be a happy outcast than a miserable duchess." He left my chambers without another word, and I sank onto my bed, trembling with the aftermath of confrontation. I had done it. I had secured my freedom, or at least the promise of it. The road ahead would be long and difficult, full of legal complications and social consequences I could not yet foresee. But for the first time in years, I was walking that road by my own choice, toward a destination of my own making. The divorce proceedings took months, conducted in private chambers, away from the prying eyes of the public. Richard kept his word, accepting responsibility for the dissolution of our marriage without contesting my claims. The settlement was generous, more generous than I had expected, and I suspected that Vivienne had played a role in that. She wanted him free to marry her, and she was willing to pay handsomely for the privilege. I did not begrudge her the victory. In truth, I pitied her. She was getting Richard, after all. A man who had proven himself capable of profound deception and casual cruelty. I hoped for her sake that he would be different with her. But I suspected that leopards did not change their spots so easily. Sebastian stood by me through all of it, as he had promised he would. He could not be seen with me publicly, not while the divorce was pending. But he wrote to me every day, long letters full of encouragement and affection and plans for the future we would build together. I kept those letters in a box beside my bed and read them each night before I slept, drawing strength from his words when my own courage faltered. The decree was granted on a gray March morning, delivered to me by a solicitor who could not quite meet my eyes. I was no longer the Duchess of Blackwood. I was simply Eleanor Ashford again, a woman of independent means and uncertain reputation, free to make of her life whatever she chose. I chose Sebastian. We married quietly, in a small church in Hertfordshire, not far from the estates where we had played as children. There were no society guests, no elaborate celebration, only a handful of true friends and the vicar who had christened us both. I wore a simple gown of ivory silk, and Sebastian looked at me as I walked down the aisle as if I were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "I have loved you since I was 12 years old," I told him that night, as we lay together in the bedroom of his country estate, the moonlight streaming through the windows. "I saw you teaching that stable boy to ride, patient and kind when everyone else ignored him, and I thought, that is the sort of man I want to marry someday." Sebastian laughed, pulling me closer against his chest. "You never told me that." "I never told anyone. It seemed too precious to share, too fragile to survive exposure to the real world." I traced patterns on his skin, marveling at the simple intimacy of touch. "And then I grew up, and you married Margaret, and I married Richard, and I thought that childhood dream had died forever." "Dreams do not die," Sebastian said softly. "They simply wait, sometimes for years, until we are ready to receive them." The first year of our marriage was not without challenges. Society, as Richard had predicted, was not kind to divorced women, even those who remarried respectably. We were excluded from many events, snubbed by former friends, whispered about in drawing rooms across London. But we had each other, and we had our small circle of loyal companions, and we found that we did not miss the glittering world we had left behind. We spent most of our time in the country, at Sebastian's estate in Hertfordshire, where the staff treated me with a warmth I had never experienced at Blackwood House. I learned to manage a household that felt like a home rather than a museum. I planted gardens and visited tenants and read books from Sebastian's extensive library without asking anyone's permission. I learned to be happy in ways I had forgotten were possible. And in the autumn of our first year together, I discovered that I was carrying Sebastian's child. I told him on an October evening as we walked together through the gardens I had planted, the leaves turning gold and crimson around us. He stopped in his tracks, his face cycling through shock and joy and something that looked almost like fear. "A child," he repeated, as if he could not quite believe the words. "Eleanor, are you certain?" The physician confirmed it this morning. I took his hands in mine, feeling them tremble. "Are you pleased?" "Pleased?" He laughed, a sound of pure, unrestrained happiness. "I am terrified. I am overwhelmed. I am the happiest man in England." He pulled me into his arms, holding me so tightly I could barely breathe. A child, our child. I had given up hope of ever. "I know," I said, understanding what he could not say. He and Margaret had wanted children desperately, had tried for years without success. The grief of that unfulfilled longing was one of the sorrows he carried with him still. "She would be happy for us," Sebastian said quietly, and I knew he was speaking of Margaret. "She always wanted me to find happiness again, even when I could not imagine such a thing was possible." "Then we will honor her memory by being happy," I replied, "by raising this child with all the love and kindness that both of us have to give." Our daughter was born on a snowy February night, delivered by a midwife who declared her the healthiest infant she had seen in 20 years of practice. We named her Margaret Eleanor, for the woman Sebastian had loved and lost, and the woman I had been before I learned to love myself. I held her in my arms as the sun rose over the snow-covered fields, and I thought of all the paths that had led me to this moment. The midnight procession, the locket, the confrontation with Richard, and the confession in Lady Ashworth's retiring room. All of it. Every moment of pain and fear and uncertainty had brought me here, to this bed, with this man, holding this perfect, miraculous child. "What are you thinking?" Sebastian asked, settling beside me on the bed, his finger tracing the curve of our daughter's cheek. "I am thinking about that night at the carriage procession," I said. "I am thinking about how I saw that locket and thought my life was ending. And now? Now I understand that it was not an ending at all. It was a beginning. The end of the life I thought I wanted, and the beginning of the life I was always meant to have." Sebastian kissed my forehead, then the forehead of our sleeping daughter. "I love you, Eleanor Hartwell. I love you more than I have words to express." "And I love you," I replied. "I love you, and I love our daughter, and I love this life we have built together from the ashes of everything we lost." Outside the window, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white. Somewhere in London, society was carrying on with its endless round of balls and gossip and petty intrigues. Somewhere, Richard and Vivian were living whatever life they had made for themselves, bound together by passion or habit or simple proximity. But I was here, in a warm bed, with a husband who adored me and a daughter who represented everything I had ever hoped for. I was here, and I was happy, and I was finally, irrevocably, free. The girl who had entered that carriage on that frozen December night had believed that her worth was measured by her husband's approval, by society's acceptance, by her ability to conform to expectations she had never chosen. That girl had been shattered by the sight of another woman's portrait hanging around her husband's neck. But from the pieces of that girl, a woman had emerged. A woman who knew her own value. A woman who had fought for her freedom and won. A woman who had learned that the greatest scandal of all is living a life without love, and that the greatest triumph is finding the courage to claim the happiness you deserve. I closed my eyes and let sleep claim me, my daughter warm against my chest, my husband's hand wrapped around my own. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments of doubt and determination. But tonight, I rested in the knowledge that I had found my way home at last. And home, I had discovered, was not a place at all. It was a person. It was a love that had survived loss and scandal and the judgment of a world that did not understand. It was the family I had chosen and the future we would build together, one day at a time, one precious moment at a time. This was my story. Not the story society had written for me, but the story I had written for myself. And it was, at long last, a story with a happy ending. In the years that followed, I often thought about the woman I had been before that fateful night. She seemed like a stranger to me now, that timid creature who had measured her worth by her husband's indifference, who had spent her days waiting for crumbs of affection that never came. I did not mourn her exactly, but I understood her. I understood the forces that had shaped her, the expectations that had constrained her, the fear that had kept her trapped in a life that was slowly suffocating her spirit. I was grateful to her, in a way, grateful that she had survived long enough for me to emerge from her chrysalis, grateful that somewhere deep inside her, beneath all the layers of propriety and submission, there had been a spark of something stronger waiting for the right moment to ignite. Society eventually forgave us, as society always does when the next scandal comes along to capture its attention. Within a few years, Sebastian and I were invited back into the fold, our transgressions, if not forgotten, then at least set aside in favor of newer, fresher gossip. We attended events selectively, choosing only those that promised genuine pleasure rather than mere obligation. We hosted gatherings at our country estate, intimate affairs where conversation mattered more than display, where guests were chosen for their character rather than their connections. Lady Ashworth, to my eternal amusement, became one of our most frequent visitors. The woman who had once threatened to destroy me had, over time, developed a grudging respect for my refusal to be destroyed. She claimed to find our story romantic, though I suspected she simply enjoyed being close to the source of what had been the scandal of the decade. I tolerated her presence with equanimity, secure in the knowledge that she could no longer harm me. Richard and Vivian married eventually, as I had known they would. I heard that they were happy, or at least content, which was perhaps the most any of us could hope for. I bore them no ill will. Whatever Richard had done to me, whatever pain he had caused, it had led me ultimately to Sebastian, to Margaret Eleanor, to a life richer and fuller than anything I could have imagined in my most hopeful dreams. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and Sebastian lay sleeping beside me, I would slip out of bed and walk to the nursery where our daughter slept. I would stand by her cradle and watch her breathe, this small, perfect person who represented everything I had fought for, everything I had risked, everything I had gained. And I would whisper to her the truth I had learned through so much pain and so much joy. "You are worthy of love," I would tell her. "You are worthy of happiness. Never let anyone convince you otherwise. Never let anyone make you small." She would stir in her sleep, perhaps hearing my voice on some level beyond waking, and I would bend to kiss her forehead before returning to my own bed, to the warmth of my husband's arms, to the life I had built from the ruins of the one I had lost. The locket still existed somewhere, I supposed. Perhaps Vivian had it now, perhaps Richard had thrown it away, perhaps it had been lost in the chaos of our separation. I no longer cared. It had served its purpose, that small oval of gold and pearls. It had shown me the truth of my marriage, yes, but more importantly, it had shown me the truth of myself. I was stronger than I had known, braver than I had believed, capable of a love deeper and more transformative than anything I had dared to dream. And that, in the end, was the greatest gift that Richard's betrayal had given me. Not freedom from him, though that was precious enough, but freedom from the woman I had been, the woman who had accepted so little because she believed she deserved nothing more. I deserved more. I had always deserved more. And finally, blessedly, I had found it. The snow continued to fall outside my window, covering the world in white, erasing the tracks of yesterday and leaving a blank canvas for tomorrow. I smiled as I drifted toward sleep, one hand resting on my daughter's cradle, the other reaching for my husband in the darkness. Tomorrow would be a new day, and I would greet it as I greeted all my days now, with gratitude and courage and an open heart. This was my story, and it was, at long last, exactly as it should be.